Jan de Bont's a Dutch-born cinematographer who dreamed of being a director. He got his start in the industry in the 1960s as a cinematographer shooting films in the Netherlands. He looked at his time filming movies in Europe as great experience, but knew he wanted to be directing films in Hollywood, something he'd been planning since he was 12. In 1973, he worked with Paul Verhoeven on the breakout hit Turkish Delight. The film was, and still is, the most successful Dutch movie in history. De Bont had been working in the industry for over 10 years when he decided to make the move to Hollywood. In the mid-1970s, he was offered a job from one of the producers of The Exorcist, Noel Marshall. De Bont was stunned to find out the shoot was going to be 5 months, which was crazy. The longest movie shoot in Europe was on average 5 to 6 weeks. He joined as the cinematographer, and that movie was the 1981 film Roar, the movie that nearly killed him and everyone else involved in the production. Roar ended up being his first Hollywood film, and while he had American films that came out before that, like Private Lessons, they were shot afterwards. It was Roar's many production problems that made it take 5 years to finish. If you want more on that, check out Exploring Roar. De Bont continued in Hollywood as a cinematographer, working on numerous massive films like Die Hard, Black Rain, The Hunt for Red October, and Lethal Weapon 3. In the early 90s, De Bont reunited with Verhoeven on the massively successful erotic thriller, Basic Instinct. While he was working on what would become some of the best-known films of the time, he was growing tired of shooting someone else's vision, saying how frustrating it was when he would have done things differently. His directorial debut had a convoluted start. Thanks to the likes of Steven Seagal and Jean-Claude Van Damme, action movies were becoming very actor-focused. Hollywood was looking for the next action hero superstar to compete with the new guys, as well as the heavy hitters like Schwarzenegger and Stallone. Jeff Speakman was a Kenpo expert who'd been acting in small parts in movies like Slaughterhouse Rock and TV shows like Hunter. His physical ability and good looks made it so he could be the next big thing. Speakman was in the process of signing a multi-picture deal with Paramount. Speakman's first film for the studio was the modest hit The Perfect Weapon. They gave him a script that was going to be his second film, and he loved it. He saw this as the film that would make him a megastar. Paramount wanted John McTiernan, the director of Die Hard, for the film, but he wasn't interested, and suggested they hire Jan de Bont, his cinematographer on Die Hard, which they did. Shortly after that, there was a regime change at Paramount, and the head of the studio was fired, who was also the guy who signed the contract with Speakman. The common practice with Hollywood is with new people coming in, they get rid of all the old stuff. The new head of Paramount didn't like what was supposed to be Speakman's second film, and put the script in turnaround. That way they could sell it to another studio to recoup the money they already invested in it. De Bont took the script to 20th Century Fox and they bought it immediately. Since Speakman had his contract with Paramount, he was dropped from the project. That film was the mega blockbuster Speed. Unfortunately for Speakman, the studio lowballed his next 2 contractual films to ride out his contract, and it ended up ruining his career. He continued making movies, but he didn't have the trajectory he would have had. Meanwhile, Speed made Keanu Reeves an action hero and De Bont an in-demand action director. Having a hit film in Hollywood is always good for your career, and De Bont quickly started getting offers from all over. After looking at his offers, he decided to go with a big one. In July of 1994, De Bont signed on to direct what would be a massive film for Hollywood, Godzilla. The story was by screenwriters Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, the guys who would later do the Pirates of the Caribbean series. De Bont went to Japan and met the heads of Toho, who loved his ideas. He said, "The writers I had were fantastic. The script was so good. It stayed true to the old Godzilla movies, but then taking place in the United States. Stan Winston and his team were doing some amazing work. They made updated character designs for Godzilla and his opponent, a new shape-shifting monster called the Griffin. They were in full pre-production when the studio put the whole thing on pause." De Bont told the studio his movie was going to cost between $140 and $180 million, which was way more than the studio wanted to pay. De Bont had countless meetings with the TriStar executives. He worked with the writers to do some rewrites to bring the budget down, but it seemed the studio had other things in mind. De Bont said there was a push coming from Sony, the owners of TriStar, to make the film less Japanese, so it would appeal to an American audience. They saw the designs and requested they make Godzilla look more like a T-Rex in order to piggyback off the blockbuster Jurassic Park. Even though the studio had already spent a truckload of money on the film, they halted production, released de Bont from his contract, and blamed the whole thing on the budget. De Bont said letting him go over the budget was just an excuse. As per his contract, they paid de Bont $4 million for his work on the film. After de Bont left, TriStar offered it to Roland Emmerich, who turned it down. He said, "I was never a big Godzilla fan. They were just the weekend matinees you saw as a kid. You'd go with all your friends and just laugh." Emmerich instead went off to work on an alien invasion film that he described as War of the Worlds meets Pulp Fiction. Years later, the Godzilla project was revived, and again they offered it to Roland Emmerich. After repeatedly turning them down, he agreed, and did Godzilla in 1998. Time proved de Bont was right when he said he wasn't let go over the budget. Emmerich made the Americanized version of Godzilla, and it not only cost more than de Bont's version, over $200 million including marketing, it was largely hated by audiences. It drastically underperformed, making only $379 million worldwide. Independence Day cost $75 million and made $817 million worldwide. Godzilla cost more than double Independence Day and made less than half. The complete story of this is over on the website Sci-Fi Japan. Anyway, back to the early 90s. Meanwhile, while this was going on, there were some rumblings over at Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment. Around this time, in the wake of the massive blockbuster Jurassic Park, special effects were evolving. Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment was looking at what could be done with this new technology. While Jurassic Park brought back dinosaurs with a mix of practical effects and computer animation, they were curious to see if they could bring back disaster movies in a way that had never been done before. They looked at the different disasters and decided the biggest one that hadn't ever been done realistically before was tornadoes. Up to this point, most audiences connected tornadoes with The Wizard of Oz. Spielberg commissioned the studio ILM to do a test. This was to see the feasibility of creating realistic tornadoes digitally. They needed to make sure the technology was up to the task before moving forward on anything. The team took 10 weeks to put together some test footage for the executives. And this was what they came up with. The executives were blown away. What was even more impressive was that almost everything was done with the computer. The only thing that wasn't digital was the truck. They explained the tornado was done via building a spine and surrounding it with a particle generator. They used a software called Dynamation from the company Wavefront. The software was used for the Nexus in Star Trek Generations and the transformations in The Mask. The visual effects clip ultimately decided whether the movie was made. Nothing else. Not the script. There wasn't even a hint of a script at the time. They hired writer Jeffrey Hinton to put together a treatment he titled Catch the Wind. Since Spielberg had just worked with author Michael Crichton on Jurassic Park, he wanted to bring him back to take this treatment and turn it into a full screenplay. Crichton co-wrote the screenplay with his then-wife Anne-Marie Martin for $2.5 million, which was one of the largest fees ever paid for a screenplay at the time. Crichton said the script was based on a combination of a PBS documentary about tornado chasers and the 1940 Howard Hawks comedy, His Girl Friday. At some point along the way, they decided to call the screenplay Twister. Although in 1989 there was a comedy that involved tornadoes, also called Twister. That film had an extremely limited release, and they were sure there wouldn't be any sort of brand confusion. Spielberg was considering directors for the film. Heavy hitters like James Cameron, Robert Zemeckis, Tim Burton, and John Badham were on the short list. At one point, Spielberg thought about doing it himself. However, after much consideration, they decided to make an offer to Jan de Bont. With de Bont freed from the Godzilla project, he was available to take the job. De Bont won out over Michael Bay, who at the time was looking to move away from directing commercials and music videos. De Bont had more experience with movies, which was the main reason he was chosen. This was the second time de Bont beat Bay, as he was also trying to get the job on Speed. They sent de Bont a copy of the script. He liked it, but said, "Can we do it?" He wasn't sure about it effects-wise. They brought him in to see the ILM clip. Much like the studio execs, that was what sold him. He now understood they could handle the visual effects, but he wanted to know if he could rework the script. He was happy with the structure, but it needed more. The dialogue as it was written felt flat, and for a movie that was going to be this exciting, the dialogue had to be equally energetic. If not, the whole thing would start to feel stilted. So even after the $2.5 million that they spent, more time and money had to go into the Twister script. It was written and rewritten, but de Bont wasn't entirely happy. He said it read like the older action movies. The writers didn't seem to understand the idea of this movie was that the action events were taking place in the background of the dialogue scenes. It wasn't like a normal action movie where they would be doing dialogue, action. There was meant to always be action, even when there was dialogue. Beyond that, he felt the pacing was off. He decided the way to fix this was to have the actors do a lot of improv on set, as well as to do some rewriting while they were filming. The story was about a team of storm chasers, two of which, in the middle of a divorce, are working together to launch an advanced weather alert system during one of the most dangerous outbreaks of tornadoes in history. The film was officially greenlit in late 1994, and they were planning on shooting in the spring of 1995 during tornado season. They wanted to film in Oklahoma and Iowa, right in areas considered Tornado Alley. This way, they'd get lots of storm footage they could use in the film. Over at ILM, they brought in Stephen Fangmeyer as the visual effects supervisor. In the late 1980s, he was working with storm chasers at the University of Illinois' National Center for Supercomputing Applications, making tornado simulations on the computer, which was what helped him to get the job. He had just finished working on Casper, and this would be his first time as supervisor. While watching whatever tornado footage they could find, it sadly was all low-quality VHS footage, so there wasn't anything they could use as stock. To combat this, before principal, they sent 2 second-unit camera crews out to Oklahoma to capture as much storm footage as they could. Unfortunately, the area was experiencing one of the most uneventful tornado seasons in history. They wanted stormy weather, and what they got was unseasonably nice days. Nothing but endless sunshine. They were able to get some storm footage, and were even able to get a mesocyclone, the precursor to a full tornado, but they weren't able to get any footage of an actual tornado. The team held meeting after meeting. How are we going to create the impression of bad weather when every shot is pure sunshine? They needed to figure out what they could do practically and what they could do digitally, then how they were going to blend those two things together. After much trial and error, they decided they'd have to composite digital storms to cover up the sunny skies. Since there wasn't a ton of quality tornado footage, this created a lot of guesswork. They were figuring out what they thought some of these effects would look like while referencing low-resolution VHS storm footage. While working on the look of the tornadoes, they started searching for something that could emulate gale force winds. This led them to the airplane graveyard in the Mojave Desert, in search of what would be the largest fan they could find, a jet engine. They talked to the staff there, and they fueled up a Boeing 707. After seeing the massive amount of wind it created, they said, "We'll take 2." While the effects team was figuring everything out, they started working on the cast. The studio naturally wanted a bunch of A-listers. This wasn't going to work. De Bont requested a cast of quality, lesser-known stars. He wanted actors who weren't whiners. He knew this would be a physically demanding film and needed a cast that wouldn't be divas on set. For the main character of Bill, the studio tried to hire Tom Hanks. Hanks decided this wasn't a good fit for him and dropped out so he could write and direct his first feature, That Thing You Do. Apparently, he suggested in his place that they hire Bill Paxton. When Paxton came into audition, de Bont was nervous. De Bont liked him, but his hair was too short. Paxton had just finished Apollo 13, and he had a buzz cut. De Bont wanted his hair to be longer so it would flow in the wind, and Paxton assured him that his hair grew fast. So by the time they were ready to film, he had more than enough hair. De Bont had one person in mind to play Joe, Helen Hunt. He'd seen her in other things, and thought she had the right toughness and attitude for the role. The studio thought otherwise. At the time, Hunt had been in movies before, like 1984's Trancers, but she was largely known for her TV work, mostly the popular show Mad About You, which was on its 3rd season. They thought a TV actress wasn't the right fit for a big-budget movie. De Bont agreed to do a few casting sessions, but every time told the studio there wasn't anyone he wanted. The studio gave in and hired Helen Hunt for the role of Jo. As an added bonus, Hunt had previously worked with Bill Paxton in the 1989 film Next of Kin, so they already knew each other, which would help with their on-screen chemistry. For the character of Melissa, they wanted to have actress Jamie Gertz audition. Gertz had slowed down her acting career in the early 90s, deciding to focus more on being a mom. When she was contacted for an audition, she was 9 months pregnant and didn't really feel like auditioning. However, they talked her into it. 2 weeks before her audition, she had a C-section and gave birth to her second child, Nicholas. At that point, none of her clothes fit. She went into the audition wearing a Hawaiian shirt and her husband's jeans. Despite what she felt was a disastrous audition, she got the part. Cary Elwes was hired to be the evil Dr. Jonas Miller, a direct competitor of the Storm Chasers. While doing research for the film, de Bont met with real Storm Chasers at the University of Oklahoma. He said they all looked like grad students, so that was who he based the team on. This was the group he had in mind when he assembled the supporting cast. The last person they cast was Philip Seymour Hoffman. This would be one of his largest earlier roles. The first week the actors arrived, they had them do wind tests. They had them stand in the wake of the jet engines to see how it looked. The engines were so loud, the actors had to be fitted with special earpieces so they could hear the commands from the director. Filming started on May 1st, 1995. The movie was a co-production between Warner Brothers and Universal. Warner Brothers would distribute in the US, and Universal would distribute internationally. Now that filming started, Joss Whedon was hired to punch up the dialogue.
Greenwich.
He just worked on speed for de Bont doing the same thing. He caught bronchitis and had to leave the shoot. So Steve Zalian and Jeff Nathanson were brought on board to work on the script, all of which went uncredited. The movie had plenty of nods to The Wizard of Oz. Helen Hunt was Dorothy, Bill Paxton was the Scarecrow, Jamie Gertz was the Cowardly Lion, and the rest of the crew with the technology was lumped in as the Tin Man.
We're off to see the wizard!
The obvious homage being the weather tracking device named Dorothy. Even though Warner Brothers owned The Wizard of Oz, the production team still had to fight to get the okay to use the name. The actual Dorothy device was based on the real-world device called Toto, the Totable Tornado Observatory. On the first day of filming, they were using real dust with the fans, which blew in the actors' eyes and they couldn't see. It became apparent that was going to become another visual effect that had to be reshot. ILM was going to have to add in all the dust particles in post. De Bont had many side jobs before becoming a director. He frequently worked on a variety of commercials. One gig was filming some spots for a new Dodge Ram truck. Ford and Chrysler were having an advertising war to get their vehicles in the film. Ultimately, de Bont chose Chrysler because he liked the look of the new Dodge Rams. Dodge gave them 5 of the new Rams, as well as 8 minivans, and some of the other vehicles, including the Jeep. They were able to do whatever they wanted with the trucks, to use in the film and destroy if needed.
Where's my truck?
It was a good thing they had multiple ones because they often got stuck in the mud or broke down. When they were filming, they had people constantly watching the Doppler. If there was a warning within 5 miles, they'd pack up and move away. This was complicated because they had to take down the cranes and whatnot every time there was dangerous weather. The weather in Oklahoma changed on a minute-to-minute basis, so it was always unexpected. This created a massive headache for the camera operators, who were often being told to completely move to a new shot because the weather changed. The shoot was very stressful. Roughly 5 weeks into filming, and de Bont hit one of the camera operators for missing a cue. Every shot cost a fortune, and so they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. By this point, though, many had had it. The original DP, Don Burgess, and his camera crew of about 24 people quit on the spot. He said de Bont was out of control and refused to work with him. This immediately stopped the production. They were looking for a replacement and were able to bring in Jack N. Green and his team to take over. Green was a cinematographer who frequently worked with Clint Eastwood, and he just received an Oscar nomination for Best Cinematographer on Unforgiven. Now they were a week behind in production and had to move fast in order to keep going. They had the 707 jet engines mounted on 40-foot trailers so they could pan and tilt. Above the engines, they mounted huge hoppers they loaded with lightweight debris to launch at the actors. Nothing with sharp edges. Each jet put out 10 1,000 pounds of thrust. They found a factory that did blow molds and hired them to make tons of things they could use for debris. Anything they thought would be caught up in a tornado. Bottles, dishes, and so on. The props of everyday items were made out of rubber. Things like the tricycle and road sign. They made countless rubber tree branches. After each location shoot, they had a local branch of the Boy Scouts who they hired to come in and clean up the area. The debris was all made out of biodegradable material, so if any of it was missed during cleanup, it wouldn't harm the environment. A late addition to the film was the flying cow.
Another cow.
Actually, I think that was the same one.
De Bont wanted to add some humor into the movie, and someone brought up this story. It was inspired by a real farmer who had a tornado pass through his land and found all of his cows a mile down the road still alive. One of the visual effects guys worked on Jumanji and was able to reskin and modify a zebra model to a cow. To animate it, ILM employed the same methods used on Jurassic Park. Fangmeyer said, "It's not that difficult because we had done dinosaurs. When the truck's on the bridge and gets stuck between two tornadoes, it spins around. They did this by placing the truck on a giant turntable they were able to spin as needed." You'll notice that throughout the film, the camera almost never stops moving. This gives the action scenes and even the dialogue scenes a greater sense of urgency. When they were first planning the shoot, they thought they could shoot practical rain and debris, but with the camera moving constantly and so many elements in the film, it became clear this wouldn't work. The ILM team decided for the shots when there would be other effects, such as tornadoes, they'd also handle the rain and dust. This increased their workload, but was easier than trying to composite around them. After the rush of the first few Twister encounters, they take a break for some character development and their relationships in a way that felt natural and didn't slow down the film. De Bont wanted to get through these scenes as quickly as possible and then to get back to the action. De Bont was looking at what they could add to the film to make it more dynamic, and he had the notion to add hail, although he would later regret this decision. Making hail in the middle of Oklahoma proved more difficult than he imagined. Special effects supervisor John Fraser spent months looking for a way to create practical hail. Normally ice machines are used to create snow, so they took one of these machines and changed some of the grinding gears, so instead of it making snowflakes, he was able to make golf ball-sized hailstones. They needed giant blocks of ice but couldn't find any in Oklahoma. They had to have them shipped in from out of state. When they needed hail, they'd pull the ice blocks out of the freezer and load them into the machines, which chopped them up and launched them at the actors. The producers were worried someone would get hurt, so Fraser decided to test it on himself. The machines launched the hail about 50 feet in the air, and they were pretty widespread, so he only got hit once in a while. He said he could feel it when he got hit, but it wasn't all that bad. De Bont and the producers did the same thing and agreed that it was okay before they allowed it to be done to their stars. They did some tests and the hail wasn't appearing well on the screen. They came up with a simple solution. They poured milk all over the ice, which stuck to the ice, and when they sent it through the grinder, the white helped them to appear better on film. They added a gallon of milk to each 350-pound ice block. In the close-up shots, it was practical hail, but for the wide shots, it was digital. For a major part of the film, they essentially needed a town they could destroy. They found this in the real town of Wakita, Oklahoma. The town had an abundance of houses that were all empty, and the locals were looking to get rid of them one way or another. So the studio bought them. They paid about $10,000 per house with the intention of destroying them. The art department came in and wrecked a strip in the middle of town, which was already in heavy disrepair after being damaged in a recent storm. The entire 5-block town was their set. They filled the streets with debris and did everything they could to match the photos they had, like put cars up in trees. It took about a month to clean up the mess. The ants' house exterior was built in a way that they could get it to collapse on command. Then the interior was a set they built in a warehouse in Oklahoma. While Green, the DP, was setting up a shot, the hydraulic system used in the house was accidentally turned on while he was standing on the set. This caused him to bang his head and hurt his back. He left the production for the remainder of the shoot. With time and budget becoming a major issue, De Bont took over as the DP for the rest of the shoot. The first 2/3 of the film were in Oklahoma, but now with the seasons changing, they moved to Iowa for the last third. When they were making the F5 tornado, De Bont kept telling them he wanted it bigger. They finally agreed on a size and made it about a mile wide. When the F5 makes it to the tractor dealer, they built a full-scale farm combine and tractors. They built them out of aluminum because a real combine weighs about 30,000 pounds, while this was about 3,000. They were suspended in the air and dropped from helicopters. They did this to get the best reaction from the actors. It looks dangerous, but they had multiple safety measures in place. They used longer lenses to make the distance seem shorter, so if there was an issue, they had plenty of time to hit the brakes. Coming out of the F5 was one of the biggest effects in the movie, the tanker explosion. The full-size tanker was mostly aluminum, rubber, and fiberglass. It was rigged with 400 gallons of gasoline. It weighed about 3,000 pounds and was dropped on the road via crane. The first time they did it, it was mistimed and they needed to do it again. Problem was, it was very expensive. According to the visual effects team, the tanker was replaced with CG. The house rolling onto the road was also CG, although the next part was split between the practical and the digital effects teams. The practical team had to build a partial house, 2 thin walls held by a crane. Then the digital team built the inside where the truck would drive through, and they also had a real interior built. So some of the shots are CG, while others are the practical set with the truck driving through it, and then the false back the truck would drive out of. The 2 leads took more than a few bumps while making the film. At one point early on, they had these massive lights on set. Paxton and Hunt looked into the lights for too long and got photokeratitis, which is essentially an eye sunburn. The 2 had to get special eye drops to heal and wore protective glasses for the next few weeks. When the duo were in the muddy water towards the beginning, the water was so dirty, they had to get hepatitis shots. One time Hunt got up too quickly and banged her head on the low bridge. Paxton was pelted with ice and had a few things hit him in the head. While filming the end sequence of the duo jumping out of the truck, Hunt tried to jump away, but the corn hit the door and slammed it on her head, giving her a concussion. For the next shot, they propped it open and locked it so that wouldn't happen again. As the delays continued, this caused a major problem. They were about to lose one of their stars. They were filming on a deadline. Helen Hunt was on the very successful sitcom Mad About You, and the Twister shoot was originally scheduled to end before she had to return to shoot season 4. Filming on Twister ran so far off schedule, they had to have a meeting with the show's creators and Paul Reiser to ask if they'd delay the show's production for 2.5 weeks so they could finish filming. Thankfully, they agreed and they were able to keep going. The ending was done on a real farm they bought so they could destroy. The buildings were a mixture of real and digital. The pump house had bungee cords pulled tight to hold the walls in place. When they were released, the planks shot up in the air. For the big finale in the pump house, the practical team lamented over what they were going to do. The tornado was going to pass over the duo, and they were supposed to be lifted into the air. How could they do this authentically? If they did it with wires, it would look like it was done with wires. After some tests, they decided to make it so they were in a mechanical room that would be rotated. The actors were going to do the stunt themselves. They'd lose their grip and fall upwards because that was how the building was rotated. This was a classic old effect going all the way back to 1951's Royal Wedding, where Fred Astaire was dancing on the ceiling. When the camera pulls back, they wanted to show the path of destruction. Pretty much everything in the main square where the barn was real, but then the path of destruction was digital. Pepsi was an obvious product placement, and while various Pepsi products are visible, it's unclear as to if the Pepsi logo forming in the tornado was intentional or not. De Bont is a huge Kubrick fan. In each of his movies, he tries to squeeze in a reference. When the team goes to the drive-in, they're playing The Shining. De Bont was able to contact Kubrick and get the okay to use the footage. There are also 2 characters in the film named Kubrick and Stanley. The young girl here is De Bont's daughter, Aniki. The girl who plays Jo as a child was a young Alexa Vega, who would later star in the hugely successful Spy Kids movies, and now does Hallmark films. One of the pieces of wood from the barn has the director's name on it. After numerous problems and delays, principal photography ended September 1st, 1995. They hired the legendary band Van Halen to make some music for the film. Originally, Van Halen was going to record a number of songs for the soundtrack. They worked on one called Humans Being, but there was massive tension growing between Sammy Hagar and Eddie Van Halen. The whole thing hit a boiling point, and Hagar quit the band. Now without Hagar available for the vocals, Eddie and Alex Van Halen put together an instrumental track, Respect the Wind, that would play over the end credits. In a 2022 interview, Sammy Hagar revealed that they did record one other song for the soundtrack called Between Us Two. He said, "I don't know if I can resurrect it, but it's done. They're looking through the archives right now to try to remaster some of the old stuff from my era. They'll find it. That's going to be a treasure." While there was a lot of visual effects work being done alongside the filming, now was when they really went into crunch time. As the demands of the CG work grew, so did the team. ILM assembled a team of roughly 30 technical directors, 13 compositors, 9 rotoscope artists, 9 match movers, 5 modelers, as well as an unknown amount of texture artists, CG supervisors, and coordinators. They were doing training on the fly since the technology they were using was brand new and still being modified as they were using it. In order to properly program the debris and particle systems, they needed to do some tests in real life. That meant they went outside and threw boards and leaves at each other. This was to see how different things reacted, how heavy things move in the wind, as opposed to lighter things. The scene with the duo taking cover under a small bridge while a tornado passes overhead was used as a test bed for the development of production methods they would use for the rest of the film. Fangmeyer and his team watched as much tornado footage as they could find, most of which was shot on home video VHS cameras. While they did try to stick as close to scientific reality as possible, they also added in some artistic flair to make it dynamic for the audiences, and a little exaggeration to meet the director's needs. They said, "We're creating an aesthetic art piece, not a scientific visualization." The smaller tornadoes were modeled in a conical path in software called Softimage. They then deformed the cone on animated splines. After that, they added in the noise shaders. Essentially, the majority of the animation would come from the particles that were spinning around the core. The F5 was more complicated. ILM created its own software to do this. This took a lot of trial and error to get the intended effects. They learned earlier that slower means bigger. So the larger the tornado, the slower it moved. They found that if they tried to make it move quickly, it ended up looking like a miniature. Beyond that, they had to develop new rendering software that would be able to render light and soft shaded particles. A major problem was trying to blend the tornadoes with the clouds in the sky. The clouds needed to spin as well. They used a variety of tricks to make this seamless. Some had shaders mapped onto rotating spheres, others used 2D morphing tricks. They did whatever they could to make it look convincing. Compositing the tornadoes into the moving background plates and color correcting everything to match was in and of itself its own nightmare. Initially, ILM was expected to have about 150 visual effects shots. In the end, it was over 300, 135 of which were tornadoes. Some of the effects were simple things like wire removal, while others were insanely complicated ones with multiple effects going on at once, like the 2 water spouts and the moving cows. Some of the smaller details that popped up after the fact were problems they had to fix. In the reflection on the side of the truck, you could see the helicopter that was filming the scene. They had to go in and remove that digitally. The long shoot created unexpected problems. The ending takes place in a cornfield. As they were filming, the tassels in the corn started popping up, so there were shots with and without the tassels. They had to go in and remove them to keep continuity. While most of the visual effects was done in-house at ILM, they had to outsource a few things to some other companies. One such company was called Band from the Ranch, a team of ex-ILM artists who left there to form their own visual effects company. The reason for the name is something that warrants its own video. The geographic displays and others were made by Band from the Ranch. A few years earlier, de Bont was taking a tour for the set of Congo, where they were doing work on the displays for the fictional company Travacom. De Bont liked it so much, he hired them for Twister. The team was able to hire real news anchors from local Oklahoma news stations to shoot fake tornado newscasts. The barn at the end was made up of roughly 3,000 parts, which had to be animated to explode as the twister hit. This was no small feat and took countless hours to get right. On the audio side of things, they needed scary audio for the tornado, and not just constant wind noise. So the Foley took a bunch of sounds, mostly animal noises and cars crashing, slowed them down, mixed them together to get this weird, unsettling roaring effect. Now with things almost to completion, de Bont worked on his edit. Although something felt off. During the film, there were these nightmare sequences and flashbacks of Jo remembering a traumatic tornado event from when she was a child. In the original script, Jo's father lived. Spielberg decided that he had to die in order for Jo's obsession to make sense. She's trying to prevent what happened to her from happening to another family. They had some late reshoots in March and April of 1996 to shoot an entirely new opening. Originally, the movie began with the storm chasers. The new opening was young Jo and her family going into a tornado shelter and her father dying. The actor was strapped to the door, and on the other side, the crew was shaking it. They lifted him out with a crane, and then added in all the tornado effects in post. In another nod to The Wizard of Oz, the dog was supposed to be named Toto, but they couldn't get that approved by the lawyers, so they called him Toby. With the film getting closer to completion, they needed to put together a trailer that would get audiences excited. The trailer was made up of the new intro sequence, trimmed down time-wise, and pushed the audio and whatnot. Then as a way to really sell it to the audience, it ended with the clip of the tractor smashing into the truck. It didn't show too much, just enough to scare the audience and get them excited, much like the executives who saw the ILM clip all those months ago. The trailer was a massive success. Audiences everywhere were talking about the film, especially that one end clip. Now working on the new edit, de Bont wanted to build tension and then make it a non-stop roller coaster for the remainder of the film. When putting it together, he said there was a lot of establishing and exposition scenes. De Bont felt that too much exposition makes a movie less interesting. He pushed back against the studio, who wanted him to over-explain things. He said no, that'll kill the movie. The studio and producers insisted on it, and he had to put in more elements where what's going on is explained to the audience. De Bont was sad he wasn't able to take it out because he felt that the movie was going to suffer. He stressed that Gertz's character was essential to the film. She was the stand-in for the audience. In order to keep the movie going at its fast pace, they would often use her to explain what was going on. She was there for the exposition. They explained her character, which gave the info to the audience. In preparation for the film, Gertz did exactly what was required. Absolutely nothing. She did no research whatsoever, so she'd be as green as her character. Gertz said that Helen Hunt definitely had a rougher time physically than her, but she certainly did a lot more screaming. The film was originally given an R rating for violence. Wanting to get this as broad an audience as possible, they cut some of the swears and removed some of the human aftermath from the tornado. This unfortunately cut out a lot of Cary Elwes' character. Twister is now rated PG-13 for intense depiction of very bad weather. The film was originally supposed to be released on May 17, 1996. The studio was getting nervous about it, so they thought about releasing it later in the summer. Then, after the overwhelmingly positive buzz around the trailer, they moved it up to May 10, 1996. This was also so it wouldn't directly compete with Mission Impossible, which was coming out on the 17th. The schedule was insanely tight. Now with the date moved up, the visual effects team had to work night and day to get everything finished on time. The budget for the film was $70 million. After the reshoots and all the additional work ILM had to do, the budget ended up closer to $90. Wanting to capitalize on the film before it was released, there were two made-for-TV movies, Night of the Twister, which was based on the book of the same name, and Tornado! Twister hit movie theaters on May 10th, 1996, and was a huge success. It opened in first place and went on to gross nearly $500 million. It was the second highest grossing film of the year, losing out to Independence Day. Audiences loved the film, but were disappointed the tire bit from the trailer wasn't in there. Habib Zargarpur, the digital tornado designer who worked on the original effects, said, "The full effects test footage was lost, and only that 3-second segment remains. The public never saw the full thing." Twister was nominated for Best Visual Effects, but again, lost to Independence Day. With the film being a massive success, out came the lawsuits. They were sued by two writers, each claiming plagiarism. One case was thrown out, and the other was settled for an undisclosed amount. That doesn't automatically mean they ripped off the idea. It may have been simply that they didn't want to go through the hassle of the courts It was just cheaper to pay the guy off. Twister was one of the first commercial movies to be released on this new format, DVD. It was released on the same day as The Color Purple and Blade Runner. Best Buy used it for their in-house big screen sales demo units to promote the picture quality and the big thing, the audio clarity. If you were around in those days, you knew when they were doing a Twister demo. Twister was so big, it kicked off the 90s wave of natural disaster films. Volcanoes, hurricanes, meteors, you name it. As is often the case with a major production from Universal, Twister inspired an attraction at the studio's theme parks. In May of 1998, 2 years after the film was released, Twister Ride It Out opened at the Universal Studios Resort in Orlando, Florida. Twister Ride It Out lasted for 19 years until it was closed in 2015. It was replaced with Race Through New York with Jimmy Fallon. Over the years, Twister has become a beloved classic. Now here we are almost 30 years later, and Hollywood is making a remake sequel, Twisters, with a massive $200 million price tag. De Bont isn't happy about the soft reboot sequel, especially since he wasn't consulted on it at all. He said, "I think it should have been done 15 years ago, because then you might have still had a chance to do this combination of visual effects and special effects. And now, it'll be much more visual effects. It's so different by now. I think my movie would be really hard to remake. And why would you want to remake it anyway? What would you improve?" Although we already did get a remake of sorts back in 2014 called Into the Storm. It's a found footage film that isn't exactly like Twister, but it is pretty close. It's also a fairly enjoyable film on its own, and they did some impressive things within their $50 million budget, which is also why I don't understand why Twisters is $200 million. I can understand the original Twister being $90 million, because they were inventing new technology to make the movie. Why would this new one be more than double the cost 30 years later? De Bont said the 90s was the best time in filmmaking. It was at a high point of the traditional action movie, as it was a transitional period, where they were all desperate to add a new layer of life to the movies. Previously in action movies, it had all been static action. Cameras didn't move, and there were always stunt doubles, so you never had an integration of the real actor with the real stunts and the real action. Die Hard especially was a breakout movie in that regard, where they basically had the actor involved in the actual action movement. There was almost never a cutaway to a stunt double scene, so there was a better connection between the foreground and the background. That integration, I think, was extremely important. Die Hard 1988 set up what the 90s would become, as far as action was concerned. De Bont went on to direct 3 more films: Speed 2, Cruise Control, The Haunting, and Tomb Raider, The Cradle of Life. While Speed and Twister were both major hits, the other 3 were very big flops. I'm surprised The Haunting was a flop. I thought it was a hit, but looking at the numbers, it did indeed underperform. Paxton got to direct in 2001's Frailty, and he said he wanted to direct a sequel to Twister. He wanted to make a rougher version, a Jaws version, as he put it. He said he felt like they made the Pepsi Light version.
In the Gothic version, the cow would fly by once, and then you wouldn't see the cow again. Then about 15 seconds, it would just rain hamburger meat down on the car as the barometric pressure just exploded the cow.
His vision was that the daughter of Bill and Joe follow her parents into the storm chasing game. For filming, he wanted to use the 3D technology from Avatar. He thought this would be the only way a sequel would make sense, to do something different. Unfortunately, that'll never happen, as Bill Paxton sadly passed away on February 25th, 2017 at 61. Roughly a week after his death, a group of over 200 storm spotters arranged themselves over the Midwest to spell out the actor's initials using their GPS trackers. The tribute covered regions of Oklahoma featured in the movie, including the real-life town of Wichita. Roughly 2 years after the film, Helen Hunt, the actress the studio didn't want, won a Best Supporting Actress Oscar for 1997's As Good as It Gets. In 1995, roughly 8 months before the movie was released, Twister the Movie Museum opened. It's a free museum located on the main street in Wichita, Oklahoma. It houses an assortment of props from the film, and even a Twister pinball machine Paxton personally donated. They were told public interest would die down over time, but the owners say that never happened, and the museum is still open to this day. Over the years, Twister has occasionally been the butt of jokes,
The finger of God.
but no one can deny it was a massive success when it first came out. I think it still holds up. The practical effects and the CG blend together and look incredible. They really were able to make some magic here. The movie is essentially a monster film, only the monster is nature. I'm not very interested in the reboot, simply because it looks like it's including all the stuff de Bont said it would. It's too late, and it's going for the effects hard, which are nowhere near as impressive as they were back then. In fact, the overuse of effects makes something like this look boring now. Twister is an energetic ride through one of nature's scariest forces. While the CG tornadoes were a large part of Twister, de Bont stresses how there was a lot of practical effects in there, which should also be remembered. It was the blending of these two mediums that should be praised. How all the teams worked incredibly hard to make something that would stand the test of time. Much like Jurassic Park, Twister should be remembered as one of the films that pushed the technology available at the time to its absolute limits to create one of the biggest thrill rides in movie history.
Is there an F5? What would that be like?
The finger of God.